Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for our webinar today. We're going to be talking about the new requirements for timeout, isolated timeout, and physical restraint. We know this has been an issue that's really been top of mind for schools for the past couple of years now, and the law in this area has really fluctuated a lot over that time. Most recently, Public Act 102-339 was passed over the summer, and that really aimed to reduce the use of timeout, isolated timeout, and physical restraint in schools, and came up with a lot of these new requirements that we're going to talk about today. ISB also released its new rules on restrictive interventions based on the changes made by that Public Act, and those rules have been pending approval from the Joint Committee on Administrative Rules for a couple months now. So we're hoping to see those be approved and be out to kind of help guide schools as you work through these new requirements. So there's a lot of facets of the new law and the new regulations, as you all know, and we have a limited amount of time today. So today we're going to focus on identifying when the new restraint and timeout requirements are triggered and when they're not. So I'm Emily Tulloch. I'm an attorney here at Franczek, and I'm joined here today by my colleague, Jennifer Smith.
Hi.
So let's jump right in on the definitions of timeout, isolated timeout, and physical restraint. So I'll start with timeout and isolated timeout. Timeout is defined in the regulations as a behavior management technique for the purpose of calming or de-escalation that involves the involuntary monitored separation of a student from classmates with an adult for part of the school day. This is only for a brief time, and it's in a non-locked setting. So timeout only involves situations when a student is in a monitored enclosure due to exhibiting behavior that poses an imminent danger of serious physical harm to the student or to others. And this does not cover, momentary removals for a student that's being disruptive or that might need to cool down in a sensory room or a reflection area or another area that might offer positive or therapeutic supports. It's really only for when there's these imminent danger behaviors, and we'll talk about that a little bit more later. Isolated timeout is an involuntary confinement of a student alone in a timeout room or other enclosure outside of a classroom with no supervising adult at the time or inside the room at the time. An isolated timeout can only be used when the adult in the timeout room or enclosure is in imminent danger of serious physical harm because the student is unable to stop actively engaging in extreme physically aggressive behaviors.
So Emily, I was thinking about, and we're going to talk about some definitions, but I was trying to think about a way to boil this down or conceptualize it. And we're going to kind of tease out some other situations where it's not this, it's not timeout, it's not isolated timeout. But in general, I would think about it like the space is the intervention from a student being a threat. So it's sort of the same level as you could be doing a physical restraint because there's a threat, an imminent threat. But with timeout and isolated timeout, it's the room that is keeping the student and staff safe, the room itself. And we're going to talk about other reasons you use separate spaces that are not that, and that's not isolated timeout and not timeout. But it's the room is keeping either the student safe or the staff safe.
Yeah, great point. Thank you, Jennifer. In isolated timeout too, I'll just note that an adult has to supervise the student, even though they're not within that same room. An adult has to be there to supervise the student and remain within 2 feet of the enclosure at all times. This supervising adult has to be able to see, hear, and communicate with the student at all times during that isolated timeout period. And monitoring with a camera or some sort of audio device is not going to be sufficient in these circumstances.
So same thing, we're just going to go over a quick definition, and then our format's going to start to change into some of the just top questions that we've gotten about when is it or when isn't these rules apply. But physical restraint, you can again see the key components there of the definition. It does mean holding a student. It means a plan. I would boil it down to a plan hold. So we're going to try to tease out a momentary hold for student safety. So like in a situation where there's a fight, or if a student's about to step off the street in front of a vehicle, you know, those kind of unplanned where you're just grabbing a student to keep the student safe, or, you know, little kids about to jump off of a playground equipment in an unsafe way or something and someone grabs, you know, those unplanned touching for safety is different than physical restraint is going to be an actual planned hold where you're using a technique to continue to hold the student and keep the student safe. There are some, you saw, you know, I could touch on, there's some other specific types of holds where there's requirements for. So the prone physical restraint is specific to when a student's held face down. And then we get into mechanical restraint where something, a device or equipment would be used to immobilize a student. We're going to talk about the bus situation and harnesses and where there's a distinction there. And then chemical restraint is where medication would be used to restrain a student. Chemical restraint does not include legally prescribed student, prescribed to address behavioral symptoms. That is not chemical restraint. So I've never actually had a situation or a call where I think the chemical restraint is triggered. It would be literally if staff gave unprescribed medicine to subdue the student. I mean, I haven't even heard that actually in a residential setting. So it's not the prescribed medication though.
Okay, and our last definition here, just to tease out a little bit, as we mentioned earlier, timeout, isolated timeout, and physical restraint are only to be used when a student's behavior presents an imminent danger of serious physical harm to the student or others, and less restrictive or intrusive measures have been tried and proven ineffective in stopping that imminent danger. So again, these are not momentary removals for disruptive students to a cool down area. It's really only for those more severe circumstances. And also isolated timeout and physical restraint can't be used as discipline or punishment for convenience, retaliation, or a substitute for educational or behavioral supports for routine safety issues, as Jennifer talked about before.
So next, we're going to go over some questions that we've received and hopefully to help clarify when do these apply, when don't these apply. So the first question is it a timeout if you put a student in a separate classroom or office? And I'll pause for a second, see if any comments or questions on that, but quickly here then revealing the answer, no. So a separate learning environment, such as separate classroom, study carrel, that is not considered an isolated timeout. I think the key thing here is it's somewhere that is used for other students to study. So it's not that the student is, it's either to give a quieter space, maybe with sensory support, or it's a disciplinary space. So in a space that is used not just for the student's discipline, but an in-school suspension room or being sent to the principal's office. If that's part of your regular protocols for discipline in the school, you can use that for special, all students. And that removal to the in-school suspension or being sent to the office to check in with administrator, that is not a timeout or an isolated timeout.
Okay, moving on to our next question. Does sending a student to a sensory room constitute a timeout? So Jennifer touched on this, but again, here, no. Isolated timeouts or timeouts don't include, using a sensory room or a room containing sensory tools to assist a student to calm or de-escalate. They also, timeout and isolated timeout also don't include student-initiated or student-requested breaks or teacher-initiated or teacher requested sensory breaks for this purpose. Again, use of a separate quiet environment is still allowed. So what about restraint? Is it restraint if you physically escort a student out of a room? So physical escort I'm gonna let you guys think about it while I define physical escort, but physical escort is, temporary touching or holding of a hand, a shoulder, an arm, for the purpose of, having a student walk or get to a safe location. So the definition of physical restraint under the new rules and regulations does not include those momentary periods of physical restriction using limited force to, either prevent a student from, harming themselves or harming others, or to remove a disruptive student who may be unwilling to leave the area voluntarily. So as long as that escort complies with these requirements, it would not constitute a physical restraint that would implicate the new regulations and requirements.
Okay, so our next question is, if a student without an IEP is restrained, do the RTO requirements apply? So I'm going to pause there for a second, but answer is yes. The new restraint, if it is a plan hold that meets all the other criteria for what a physical restraint is, and again, I'm boiling that down to essentially a planned hold, then yes, it is, the requirements are still going to apply. I would also put a flag out there that this would be a huge child find flag. If a student has escalated to the point that they meet the trigger for a planned hold, that you can do that under the law, then I would really wonder if, it would need to raise that question, is the student eligible for special education? Also, I guess the thing that comes to mind, which could be outside if it was drug related behavior, a student was under the influence but not under the influence, even there, if we're getting to the level of behavior where a restraint is required, it's just a huge red flag. So we want to put that out there. But yes, the requirements do still apply for all planned holds in the school. Okay, so next, does the use of a harness on a bus constitute physical restraint? So first of all, there is an exclusion. What's clear is that seatbelts or required if a student's of an age and the vehicle is such that you would need a child seat just to comply with the law, not specific to a student's disability, then those are definitely excluded and not restraints. If the student needs any other type of harness that's not just to comply with general broad safety requirements, then what you would want to make sure is that the IEP documents the needs for that. So things like H-strap, harnesses, vests, anything like that in a bus or vehicle that's needed, you want to make sure and put those in the IEP as something that's needed, not as a mechanical restraint. So not, it's needed to support that special transportation. It's part of the transportation service, as opposed to, and if there's, because it's also possible, I suppose, that there would be an escalation and if someone had those things available, maybe they were really there for another student, but because of the student's behavior, someone used them for a student where there was no planning that was part of the plan. There would be a potential that it would be use of a mechanical restraint. So we do want it to be part of the specialized instruction, planned, either in a 504 or an IEP. Those are, I think, are the key components to avoid. I mean, obviously other kinds of those types of restraints in the school setting, where it's not, again, planned as either, it's not planned for in another way. If they're used to restrain because of an imminent threat, then it would be a prohibited mechanical restraint. So it would, we're only saying that there's an exception for, again, safety belts, child seats, or devices planned for in the IEP for safety for special transportation.
Okay, can you hold a door closed during timeout? So I'll split this up into timeout first and then isolated timeout. So for a timeout, a trained adult, remember, has to be in the same room with the student at all times during that timeout period. So, you know, I don't really think that there's going to be a circumstance for a timeout where that supervising adult is holding the door closed or preventing the student from leaving, but those would be impermissible. Also for an isolated timeout, while the student can be left in a room by themselves while the supervising adult is outside of that enclosure, the door to the timeout room cannot be locked and it can't be held to block the student from exiting the room. So in that circumstance, a door cannot be held closed during an isolated timeout either. I'm sure the next question that comes to your mind is what happens when the student doesn't want to stay in the room? So I'll turn it over to Jennifer to talk about that.
Yeah, so then we're going to consider other interventions because, like Emily said, so locking the door is not going to be the intervention that's permissible. So what are interventions that are permissible? You know, potentially there might be a potential for either a physical restraint or direction of the student's movement that's not a restraint but direction. If a student continues to go somewhere that's not safe, so let's say they then, because you don't have them locked in the room, they literally run out of the school building. Well, then we're talking about police intervention, you know, running into the community. You start to have safety needs where you need to go outside of your school staff. And also long-term or bigger picture, you're looking at a change in placement because, you know, if you've exhausted your ability to keep the student safe in the school, then we have to look at other options. So short term, it would be all the other interventions you have to keep the student safe, whether it's, you know, physical restraint, like I said, other safety, community interventions, calling the parents and removal of the school, so a suspension, and then planning for longer term if this continues to be a need that the student has that you can't meet.
Okay, do weighted blankets, vests, or similar items implicate the RTO requirements? So not necessarily here. And, you know, an IEP team or a student's 504 team, you know, might determine that weighted items such as a weighted blanket or a weighted vest is really beneficial for an individual student. And sensory aids like this can be used under the direction of a trained professional for purposes and parameters that are described in a student's IEP or 504 plan. Still for these things, you know, the student should be able to move freely or leave if, you know, remove the item if desired. But in those types of cases, they would not be considered physical restraint. Where they may implicate the RTO requirements is when they're used as those impermissible mechanical restraints or for the purpose of discipline or punishing a student or to, you know, stop a student from moving in a behavioral situation. That's when we kind of get into those RTO requirements and it would be an impermissible mechanical restraint.
Okay, next question. Do RTO requirements apply when an SRO restrains a student? So, you know, big picture here, the school code and the requirements that apply in the ISB's regulations, they apply to school districts. So if someone else has custody of a student, whether it's the police or the parents or another agency, or you call an ambulance and there's medical professionals, they have their own requirements around safety and safety protocols and restraint. So as long as you're not using a resource officer as one of your, as if they were on your team and they're, part of your actual plan, a lot of times we really advise that there's a kind of a crisp break between a police officer's role in a school and a school personnel. And really, again, just broadly, police are responsible for totally different laws, different supervisors. So we do not want, where the line might get blurred here and we might have an issue is if, your resource officer is just walking by to try to be helpful, and then your team starts directing them, do this, do that to help with the hold, and you bring them into your protocol, that starts to blur lines. And in that case, it's possible that the school code requirements would apply, because you're almost using that person now as your employee and directing what they do. That would be a very messy legal situation. So instead, I would recommend you should not be using SRO officers as part of your team for physical restraint. And again, if the police end up taking custody of a student, then you're going to entirely let them handle how they would address the safety, the holds. That's going to be a police issue then. Same thing, actually. So I have a lot of situations where, or I've been involved in a lot of situations where parents come to the school and then, they want to take over the de-escalation. And sometimes they're holding students, obviously, in a way, they're same thing. They're the parents, when they have custody of the student, they're not part of your team. They're not subject to the same requirements. At the same point, we don't want there to be any blurriness there. So really it's the parents there. If the student's still escalated, we need to help the parent get the student into their custody or control, or maybe if they can't, then again, we're even looking for other community resources. But no one should be on your team directed by you to do a hold other than your staff.
I think this one's you.
Sorry about that. Next one. So when a teacher breaks up a fight, do the RTO requirements apply? And this is probably the question that just practically comes up the most, because it just, especially this time of year, it's getting nice out. I'm just getting all kinds of calls about fights. So in short, remember that definition we went over. No, if it's a moment, it's just a momentary physical restriction of the person to keep them from continuing to punch someone, for example, then no, that does not, the RTO requirements do not apply. I mean, you can see where if a trained individual happened to be upon a fight and they just maybe use some of their training and put a student in a hold, where the lines would start to blur. And that's, again, where things get blurry. But if in a fight situation, it would be more that momentary hold or physical escort, like Emily was talking about earlier. But typically, it would not implicate these new requirements. So we did get just a few questions during registration that we can share. We only have a few minutes left, so we'll quick go over those, and then thank you. And we will be continuing with our monthly webinars on different topics of interest. So please look for the next notice. But let's maybe share some of the questions we got in advance.
Yeah, one of the questions we got was about, whether schools have to be sending out that complaint form, the ISB complaint form with each restraint, like to parents or guardians of students. And, my response would be, that's a great way to comply with some of the requirements. So schools have to provide parents with information after each incident of timeout, isolated timeout, or physical restraint. And that includes a copy of the standards for when RTO can be used, information about the parents' rights and the students' rights, and then information about the parents' right to file a complaint and what that process looks like. So I do think that including that complaint form with each notification to a parent does satisfy some of those requirements. You're likely going to have to include some more information there, but I do think that sending it out every time is probably good practice.
So I think hopefully we answered a question we had about clarifying isolated timeout versus timeout. And definitely if a student, every time a student is removed when their behavior is escalating, again, if it fits into any of those categories that we talked about, such as they're going to just a separate area, just to be separated from peers and separated from the simulation, but it's another classroom, or it's in school detention, or it's the principal's office, or it's a sensory room. It's really any place, as long as, like I said, it's not, you're moving the student into a room so that the room is the intervention that's going to keep the student safe and keep the staff safe. So if it's for any of those other reasons, and I do think that it's going to be a little bit complicated, or you could see where there would be some grayness depending on the move. But that is the break time. So definitely every removal is not an isolated timeout or timeout.
Yeah, and then the last question that we got during registration was concerning plans. So I know it's a little bit off topic for today, but the question we got was, if we've created our district plan, our team's gotten together, we've done that, do we now have to create building specific plans? And really the answer is no. There's only a requirement to create this district wide plan that you then submit to ISB. Certainly there might be building level initiatives or tasks to help with accountability or to help you facilitate really the goals that are in your district wide plan, but there's no requirement in the new rules or regulations that require also building specific plans.
So we have about 1 minute left, but there was another question. Is there a time requirement to define a hold? Does it have to be longer than 15 minutes? So there is a time requirement in what we've been talking about as far as that breaking up a fight situation. And it doesn't define it in terms of seconds or minutes, but it talks in terms of a momentary physical restriction. So I would say if we're in the momentary, as your attorney, I would say we're seconds, not minutes. So if we're in the seconds, not minutes, and it's in the unplanned touching for safety scenario, then it's not in terms of restraint. Anything over that or different from that is a planned hold would be and would qualify. So with that, Emily, I think we're just running right up into our time limit. And so we want to thank everyone for joining us today, and again, invite you to our future monthly webinars.